I'm doing it. I am learning Blender and I'm having a lot of fun. I'm going to be going over the tutorials I've followed over the last month to learn Blender and share a couple of the things that I wish I knew before I jumped in. This video is my first month's progress report. What I've learned being a noob to this space and never having really 3D modeled before in anything. This is by far one of the hardest pieces of software I've ever just jumped into and tried to pick up. And for my own sanity, I realized at a certain point that I have to look at Blender as like three different pieces of software. The first piece of the software is the 3D modeling part, just maneuvering your way around the canvas and understanding how things are set up and what shapes and what you can create and that sort of thing. The second part is the actual rendering and texturing and all of that fun stuff that takes those 3D models and makes them look absolutely stunning when you export them. That is its own behemoth off to the side, and learning those two things alone separately is not a bad idea. And of course, the third thing is animation, and I'm familiar with other animation software out there, so I'm kind of familiar with some of the things going on here, but since you're throwing in all of Blender's tools on top of it, it's a little more complicated. The other big thing that really attracted me to Blender was a feature called Grease Pencil. It is a 2D/3D hybrid animation drawing thing. Just look at this. This is so cool. This art in particular is from DDows. Link in the description to his Instagram and YouTube and all that fun stuff. He is amazing. I dig this. This is my jam. I love this style and what he's doing here. So when I started this, I thought, okay, I'm going to start here. I've used animation software and drawing software. I can just kind of pick it up as I go. I started with one of his tutorials. Now, his tutorial is great. It's wonderful, and he does a great job of explaining things, but that was a terrible place to start. Before you jump into Grease Pencil, you really should have a foundation of understanding of Blender in general and the shortcuts and what it can do and that sort of thing before you jump into something this sophisticated. I did not. So what I ended up doing is I came here to YouTube and I jumped on Twitter and I asked you guys, hey, if someone's just learning Blender, where should they start? And overwhelmingly, like all of you, every single one of you said, make a donut. Make a donut. It's a channel here on YouTube called Blender Guru, run by a guy named Andrew, and turns out he's got these donut tutorials where he takes you step by step about learning the interface and all the basics, and you make a donut. So here's another quick tip, and something I learned very quickly when I started is I work on laptops mainly, and you really need a mouse. And if you can get a keyboard with a number pad on it, it's probably a good idea too. A mouse is an absolute necessity. Trackpads ain't cutting it. I do not have a keyboard with a number pad on it, but in pretty much every tutorial, people are using the number pad to kind of recenter their drawings and look at it directly on in the Z or Y or X axis and that sort of thing. It's a very important part of many people's workflows. There is a way around it, and I've been using that. However, if you have a mouse, which is essential, and if you have that keyboard, following these tutorials is going to be a lot easier. Now, when I went through a donut tutorial, the tutorial itself might only be like 15 minutes, but I'd say this, I would allow at least twice as much time to work through the tutorial yourself. Oftentimes with these more faster paced tutorials, some of them which were like a half hour to 45 minutes long, what I found is that it would take me an entire afternoon to work through that tutorial. And even some of these donut tutorials, even if it was like each section was 15 minutes long, it would normally take me at least a half hour, sometimes 45 minutes or an hour to make it through that 15 minutes. I'd hit play, he'd do two things, I'd hit pause, I'd go back, I'd try to do the things, one wouldn't work, I'd go back, I'd rewind, I'd be like, okay, what? And then I'd like pinch and zoom on the area of his screen to see which tab he's in. There is so much to understand here that you're going to be doing that a lot. Another tip, I don't know if this is tip 2 or 3, let's go with 3. Don't stress out if you miss something or some part of your model doesn't look the way the model looks on the screen that the person's doing in front of you. This is something I ran into a lot in a lot of different tutorials. Like I'd be modeling the donut and for whatever reason, my frosting is kind of sticking out above the donut and I'm like, okay, what's going on here? Why isn't this working? And I would lose a ton of time trying to figure out one little setting that I had forgotten to turn on or something that I had forgotten to apply or a transform that I hadn't applied. It happens all the time. And I think your first couple tutorials, the main thing you need to be worrying about is not coming up with the prettiest donut. The main thing you should be worried about is just familiarizing yourself with the interface and kind of the workflow that a lot of people go through to create these things. And it's hard. I wanted my donut to look good, but the sprinkles are too big and it's weird. And I can't say this enough. The repetition of actually creating the thing is the important part, not creating a pretty thing. Every time you have to add another cylinder or another cube to your scene, you learn that shortcut. You're reusing that shortcut. Every time you apply modifier, you're remembering what tab the modifiers are in. It's the repetition of using those tools over and over again that are the most important part of learning Blender. So that took me to the second thing that I was learning during the donut tutorial, is oftentimes he would walk through it and I would follow step by step at what he was doing. And with some of them, I would then create a new document because I'd work on a tutorial or two and then I'd come back to it like the next day because it was taking a lot of time. And what I would try to do at the beginning of the day is rehash how I got to that point. So I'd put down a new like torus shape, which is the donut shape, and I'd like try to remember all the steps he went through. This was great because I was redoing the tutorial without actually following exactly what he was doing, which was reinforcing what I was doing. However, I would do something differently, and I started doing it differently. Instead of waiting to the next day to redo that tutorial, I would do the tutorial, and then I'd immediately open a new document, and I'd do it again. Because the steps he takes for each step of the donut actually don't take that much time. It takes like 2 minutes to do each tutorial. He's just explaining a lot of stuff. So you do the tutorial, and then you redo it without his help, and it really helps reinforce what you had to do along the way. Now, I did not do the entire long, huge donut thing. I never got to animation and all that fun stuff. This is another thing I did a lot, is once I learned something, I decided, okay, I'm going to move on to the next tutorial because the donut was kind of losing my interest. I could always go back to it. I wasn't ready to jump into animation and all the extra bits. I still was trying to wrap my head around the 3D modeling part. So for my next tutorial, I followed this tutorial by TipTut where he was recreating the Moon Knight logo, which is a Marvel TV series that's rolling out pretty soon. That was cool and very satisfying. Before I dive too deep in talking to that one, I do want to shout out to today's sponsor, Loom. Loom's an app that lets you create asynchronous video messages, which are great for work. I have this really bad habit of writing really long emails, which one, take a lot of time, and two, I don't think anybody is really reading. Why do I do that? Loom lets me record my screen, my camera, or both at the same time. Instead of writing those long, time-consuming emails, I could just record a video instead. Can we change this icon to blue? Yeah, that's right. Even lets me draw on the screen when I'm recording a video. Once my video is recorded, I can share it with my team. I can share it directly via email, or I can copy the link. I've learned through experience with my design or illustration work that when I am ready to show it to the client, especially the first time, I always want an in-person meeting or at least a Zoom call to go over everything that we did. Just sending an email with a PDF in it is a recipe for feedback disaster. I need to be able to explain the design decisions we made in person so that they understand the work that they're looking at. Loom is absolutely perfect for that. They even have this auto transcript feature that lets you jump to different parts of the video if you need to ever go back and review a certain portion of it. Loom has a desktop app, iOS app, Android app, even a Chrome extension. Join Loom's 14 million users worldwide. Use my link down below in the description and try out Loom today. Okay, so what did I learn from this Moon Knight tutorial? It reinforced a lot of the things that I learned in the donut tutorial, but it did it in a different way, and that was super helpful. I also learned about how you can import things from Adobe Illustrator, which is a program I'm really familiar with. And once I learned, oh, you could do that kind of stuff and manipulate vectors and how you can set up vectors so you could turn that into a 3D object, that was cool. And again, the process of doing that is like a multi-step process, and it's very confusing. So I had to go back several times and retry it and do some various things. But as I started to understand it, I just really enjoyed this tutorial. It's very satisfying, even though I didn't fully finish it as much as he did. I finished it to the point where I felt like I had something cool. So the next day I decided I'm spending an entire afternoon on this, gonna do this. This is a 3D house by a YouTuber named Greenhorn. I chose this one because I really like this kind of soft, plasticky feel. It reminds me of the Switch remake of Zelda Link's Awakening, if you're familiar with that game. I love this feel. I love the way this looks. So this is the first tutorial that I would call like a rapid fire tutorial, where he's like press this, do that, go here, select this, press that, invert this, add this. And so even though he was doing it rather quickly, it was like I'd hit the play button, he'd do one thing. I'd go to Blender and do the thing. I ended up setting up my iPad with a tutorial on that, so I could just kind of say, okay, pause, got it, do the thing, unpause, do that next thing. Now, I talked about earlier, and I'm going to reinforce it here, is that if you don't get everything right, that's okay. Keep pushing forward, unless it's so bad that you have to rewind and figure out what you did wrong. Here, for example, the way I was extruding the walls and I built those was slightly different than the way he did. I think I missed some steps in there. I may have forgotten to like reset the transformation or whatever. Anyway, I wasn't able to bevel the walls, and so my walls are kind of hard-edged. So is the blanket on my bed. It happened again, but that's okay. I kept pushing ahead. I didn't get lost in those details, because sometimes when you get into those details, I'm like, I want the bed beveled better, and then you spend a half hour trying to figure out how to fix that one little thing, where what you should be learning is the entire interface. I still think this turned out pretty good. I'm still pretty happy with it though. This is a really good tutorial, but it's a very fast-paced tutorial, very rapid-fire tutorial. After that, I felt like the next day I was ready to just go off on my own and try something. I've learned enough about the interface. I wanted to build something without following someone else's advice and see if I could figure this out. So I started designing like an isometric building. I love isometric stuff. I done the isometric bedroom. Can I do a building in that style? First, I just started drawing shapes. I had a basic picture in my head, and I was noodling around with things and adding lots of detail. And after about like a half hour or so, I realized I'm really getting in the weeds here. This is way more detailed than I was thinking, and I'm going to end up modeling a realistic looking building front, and that's not what I intended at all. I wanted it to be simple, reinforce what I had learned, nothing too crazy. So I ended up busting open a drawing app, and I just sketched out in like an isometric view with like, this is the basic building that I want to create. And then I went back to Blender, and once I had that sketch in mind, it had basically my blueprint of what I was going to do, it was so much easier. I also added my own little touch here where I made a logo in Adobe Illustrator for my little art hut on the side, and then I imported that in, like what I had learned from that Moon Knight tutorial, and applied that to the sign. Now, overall, I learned a lot here. It was really fun to reinforce a lot of the things that I had learned, but I'm not that impressed with the final result, and I think the reason why is, as I look at this, it really looks like something I could have created in Affinity Designer or Adobe Illustrator. It's not necessarily something that had to be done in 3D. It would have been a lot faster if I had done this in Illustrator. Some of the shadows are a little softer and a little more subdued than it would have been if I had done it. But at any rate, it didn't feel that special to me, but it was still a great project and a great way to learn. All right, so hit week 3, and I decided, okay, let's start following some tutorials again, and I found this really cool character tutorial. It's got this faux plastic style. This one's by Keelan John. I'll link to his YouTube channel down below. I love his style. Again, this is kind of that plasticky Zelda style I was talking about before. I'm a big fan of this. What was really cool about this tutorial is I did it on a Sunday afternoon, and I blasted through it. And this was the first time that I was following a tutorial and I was like, I'm starting to understand what he's doing. And if you start to think about it, I had been doing Blender for like 2 weeks, and every time I jumped in, I just felt lost. Even when I was doing my own building, that went better, but that was just basic square shapes that I was tweaking here and there and sticking to each other. This was the first time I actually felt confident in what I was doing with the interface. Like I said with some of the other tutorials, I'd listen to one thing that they would do, and then I'd pause it, and I'd go back to Blender and do that one thing, and then I'd go back and listen and pause and go back and do one other thing. Here I was listening to like 4 or 5 steps, and I'd go back and I'd be like, okay, yeah, inset and extrude inside, and okay, add modifier. This was fun. This was good. Later that week, I wanted to dive back into Grease Pencil. I mean, that was the reason I started this whole thing, right? So I followed this tutorial. This is by Kevin Dram. I hope I'm saying that right. And this was cool because it started out with like this whole like, let's make 3D flowers in the vase and a window and all that stuff. This was a great tutorial, and it's not a very, very beginner basic tutorial. but it was perfect for where I was in that moment, because I picked it up and we started with some basic shapes, you know, like we took a cylinder and turned it into a table, we took some cubes, we turned it into a window, but then we started getting into these like organic flower petals and the stems, and however like we made this rose thing. Like as we were going through those steps, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. There's a second part to it at some point I want to jump in, and that dives more into the grease pencil end, where we're going to add a lot more stuff to it, and I'm looking forward to that. But just getting to this point and getting it rendered in kind of this flat, cel-shaded style, I thought I was really having fun with this. I thought this was a great tutorial. And then the last tutorial that I followed was this mushroom tutorial. This is another Tip Tut tutorial. Tip Tut also did the Moon Knight tutorial I followed earlier. This was a mix of 3D and grease pencil. So again, grease pencil's like 2D drawing on a 3D surface. And again, I had a lot of fun with this one. And kind of like that character tutorial I was talking about earlier, this was another one of those times where I just felt pretty comfortable in Blender. After a month, and it's amazing that it's taking this long, because if I used a new drawing program, I'd be used to it, you know, within a few hours. I'm at the 1 month point, and I'm finally like, I think this is starting to feel comfortable. So if you feel like you're learning slow, don't worry, I am learning slower. So I haven't done this yet. My next step is that I want to actually create something without a tutorial. I have something in mind. I want to redo one of my old Inktober sketches from a few years back. Something Mario themed. Do it in that plastic style I like so much. So I'm going to go upstairs and do that next. So I blocked off an afternoon to work on this. I didn't want to spend too long on it because I needed to finish this video. I could have just kept making elements and rocks and different bushes, and I would have loved to have gotten more stuff in the background and maybe blurred those out, gotten some depth perception in there. But overall, I feel pretty good. The only real challenging thing here was figuring out how to do the lips, but once I kind of hacked that together, it all really came together pretty well. So yeah, that has been my Blender experience. There's been some highs, there's been some lows. I'm not gonna lie. There have been times where I'm following a tutorial and I really get frustrated because I want to run, but I can't even walk yet. And I think that's a pretty normal reaction that people have. But, you know, after like an hour of frustration, you'll like hit export and you'll just have something beautiful on the screen, and it's like totally worth it. And that's what keeps me going on and on. But what do you think? If you've been using Blender, you know, do you have any tips for me as I continue to learn? Let me know down below in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next video.